We were watching TV one night, Grandpa in his chair and me in Grandma's old rocker. I sighed heavily. It had been a long day. Grandpa had me mending fences most of the day, a job that required 2 trips to town, the hauling of some heavy material, and a lot of sweating in the afternoon sun. Of course, Grandpa hadn't done any of that except for the riding into town. What he had done was mostly sit on a big rock and watch me work, filling my day with stories about this, that, or the other. The fence had finally been mended just as dark began to creep in, and I was rocking contentedly as we watched something on Grandpa's TV. Grandpa watched very little TV, but when he did, it was usually only one of 3 things. He watched the news 3 times a day, he watched Hadrian Meadows at 8 and 4 for the Fish and Game Report, and he liked to watch Spook Central. Spook Central was a show about some local paranormal investigators who liked to go around and inspect local haunts in the area. They went to many historic and infamous locations, and generally stirred up the things that went bump in the night around there. It came on most nights on Channel 12, in new episodes or in reruns, and Grandpa loved it. We watched Spook Central the way most people watch sitcoms. He was always so amused at the crew's antics, and he was always chuckling at something that they were saying or doing. Tonight's episode, though, they were talking about banishing a demon from the ruins of an old church, and I heard Grandpa scoff as they talked about the means of cleansing. "Bunch of hacks," he said, shaking his head. I glanced over at him, raising an eyebrow at the comment. "So aside from devil cats, forest lights, and cursed insects, you're also an expert on exorcism, I guess." "Of course," he said confidently. "I went with my grandma to several houses while she was helping people out. I watched her get rid of all kinds of haints and spirits and bedeviled people, but I only watched her fail once." He paused for dramatic effect before adding, "Luckily, the snake-handling man came along." I looked at him oddly. "The what?" "The snake-handling man. 'Smatter, boy? Didn't your daddy ever take you to see a snake-handler?" "I mean, I saw a man handling snakes at the zoo once, but it sounds like you're talking about one of the religious ones." "Exactly, except this fellow was the real deal," Grandpa said, getting a little excited. I muted the TV, settling in for another Grandpa story. "Sounds better than anything on TV." I turned the rocker to look at him. Grandpa chuckled. "That's 'cause unlike that claptrap on the TV, this story is true." When I was about 11, shortly after the cricket incident, Grandma took me under her wing and decided it was time that I was given a proper education on the ways of the woods. She had me over to her house most every afternoon, so I could learn herbcraft and woodcraft. She taught me about healing with poultices and salves, about repelling things that might want to get into the house with symbols and little constructed things that hold intention. She also taught me more about the creatures of the forest and the old things that lurk in the deeper parts. Grandma was a wealth of information. I wish I had been more thankful for the time that I had with her. I had studied with her for about 6 months when I arrived one afternoon to find her putting some things into a bag. I had seen her do this many times before, but the longer I watched her, the more I realized that this was different. She had gone to people's houses before to cleanse a presence or dispel a haint, but I had always watched her select her ingredients with care and decisiveness. Today, her hands shook as she selected herbs in bundles, and as one of the bottles slid from her shaking hand, I felt my blood run cold. For the first time in my life, I was seeing my grandmother afraid of something. "Despite my better judgment, I'm taking you with me tonight. Not for any lacking in yourself. You're a fine boy, but this place we're going is bad." "Bad?" I asked, unsure what she meant. "How do you mean?" She gave me an extremely hard look, as though she were weighing the idea of telling me things I might not be prepared to hear. "You know about haints. You've seen the lights. You've seen the darkness that can find you when you least expect it. What we're going after tonight might be worse. Sometimes there are things that can get into a house and make it bad. Bad as it can be. These things can make people bad, too. But you've put these things out before, I stuttered, fear creeping into my voice. That's true, but this is different. This is the true evil, the old evil, the kind they talk about in church. I've faced it before, but this time feels different. This time, I'm not sure if I have the strength or the will to cast them out. She gathered her provisions, and I sat pondering the nature of our work that night. Then, as the afternoon sun began to dip just the tiniest bit, we sat out for our work. We arrived as the sun hit the midpoint of its set, and I immediately wished I had never left my grandmother's house. Have you ever seen a place from your car, a perfectly normal place, and just felt like it was wrong? You couldn't tell why, and you couldn't say why, but the whole place just made your skin crawl. The shadows linger a little too thickly around the porch. The darkness nestles like bugs in the eaves, and the whole place just seems like a grinning mouth inviting you to come in. You drive past, and you shudder, but you aren't sure why, and it makes the place seem so scary. This house had an aura about it, and I could see Grandma getting nervous as well. The woman who answered the door was a friend of Grandma's. I'd seen her at the house before. I thought her name might be Ella or Ellen, but she had never looked so ragged as she did now. Her gray hair was a mess, all tangled and looking worry-worn. Her face was pitted with worry lines, and she seemed on the verge of tears. Whether they were tears of relief or tears of sorrow, I wasn't sure. "Thank God, Liza. Come in, come in. I didn't know who else to..." But then she noticed me, and her face clouded over. "Are you sure you want to bring him here? He's learning the trade, Els. The boy needs to see what it's like. He has to prepare for what he might face." The woman nodded and led us into her small home. It was little more than a one-story farmhouse set back against the rocks of the mountain. The place had a musty smell that made me think the roof probably leaked in the spring when the snow melts came off the hills, and it held a darkness that reminded me of a cave. The woman led us to her kitchen, casting frightened glances at the shadowy room that lay behind a tacked-up quilt. She made us tea and talked to us about what had been happening. Grandma smiled and nodded, the smoke from the tea ringing her face, but I barely listened. My eyes were only for what lay behind that simple quilt. It wasn't a noise, but it was like a low hum that seemed to warble across my senses. I had a friend, years and years later, a drinking buddy, that lived under one of those big power lines. I used to hate getting drunk over there, because I knew I wouldn't sleep a wink unless I blacked out. That hum, that soft quarreling of currents and watts, always reminded me of that sound I heard from behind that quilt. It was like tiny people discussing monumental things, like hateful men planning mischief quietly. "And so I called you," the woman said, and I found myself jerked back to the conversation, her voice jagging up on the edge of tears. "I'll do what I can, Ellie, but this sort of thing might be beyond me. I've never done battle with anything like what you're talking about, and I'm not sure that my talent will be enough to rid you of it. Have you contacted the Catholic parish over in Ella J? This sounds like their ball of wax more than mine." I wrote them when it started, when he came back from the quarry like this, but they never wrote me back. I've spoken to the Baptist preacher, the Pentecostal man, even the snake handler down the holler. You know the one with the revival tent that blew into town about a month ago. You're the only one who's come to help me." Grandma soaked all this in and gave a stoic nod. Then she finished her tea and asked to see Darryl. As Ellie walked us towards that quilt, I felt my stomach tighten. She slid it aside, the motion so much like a barker as he slid the cover off a freak show tent to reveal the most darkly hideous man I had ever seen at that time. Calling him fat would not have done him justice. Darryl, a man I realized later that I knew, looked like someone in the late stages of pregnancy who's preparing to birth a litter of 8 or more, maybe. He lay on the couch that sagged beneath him, and the smell of that small room, no doubt once a sitting room, was atrocious. Darryl clearly had just been letting it drop where it would, and the smell was a rank miasma. He lay on his back, his head lolling on his neck as his stomach pressed upwards like a hillock. His gorge was of writhing flesh, purple and veined, pulsating like an egg sac ready to burst. The room was shadowy, the windows covered with only the barest of light spilling through the openings into the sitting room. I didn't want to go in there, but when my grandma put a hand on my shoulder, I felt an assuredness roll through me and knew that everything would be okay. When we stepped into the room, the man let his head flop back on his neck and stared at us in that upside-down way that children often do. He began to burble wetly to himself as we approached, a soupy, marshy sound that pulsated like tar from a bubbling pit. When did he begin to... Grandma seemed to search for the words before flapping her hands at him. "Get like this," she finally said, words deserting her in the face of this mountainous man. "About a week. About 3 days before I called you. He came back from the quarry one night, like I told you, and just wasn't himself. The next 2 days he laid up. I thought he might have a flu, but then I woke up one morning and found him on the couch. He started swelling like this, and I called the doctor to check him out. After the doctor couldn't find anything wrong with him, he suggested that I make him comfy and see if he overed it or not. That night I lay in bed and watched the shadows dance on the wall. I heard him laughing and gargling in the sitting room and saw this strange light coming from under the door. That's when I hung the quilt, and the next day I came to see you." Grandma looked like she wanted to say more, but when she looked down, she realized that the rotund man was staring straight at her. When his mouth slid open, his purple tongue lolling out, his rancid breath was nearly as bad as the words that spilled out around it. "Witch! Witch! Witch!" As he gravelled out his accusation, the scant light we had began to flicker. The walls began to spin a little, the shadows dancing as the oppressive darkness became more claustrophobic. The swollen cadaver began to rock as he cackled and accused, and I pressed myself against my grandma as the night bled into the couple's humble abode. "Ellie Mae, how could you let this witch into our house? You know what it says in the good book about suffering a witch to live." "I would assume that whatever you are, you likely have some understanding about what the Bible says about demons as well," my grandmother countered. The fleshy hillock laughed, and I could swear that hands seemed to be pressing against his body from the inside as I watched. "Do you imagine that you can cast me out?
Do you imagine that your grasping power is a match for mine?
Grandma reached into her pocket and pulled out a bundle of sage as if in answer. That's how it all began. Grandma lit the sage and wafted the smoke as it danced and seemed to heliograph in the darkness. The smoke took on the forms of warding, swirling towards the dark shapes that surrounded the swollen hulk on the couch. As the smoke swirled, Grandma chanted in the old words, words she had yet to teach me, and never truly would, it turned out. She seemed to become smoke herself as she swayed amongst that darkness, and as her hands reached towards me, I would place atoms into them, poultices and charms, herbs and atoms of power, and it was as if my hands knew the things she needed before my brain truly did. She dabbed the man with concoctions, wafted smoke and charm over him, and I saw him shudder as she worked. He did not like her work, but it still seemed to be no more than an irritation upon his skin. As time passed, I began to feel as though the sun must rise. It had been hours after all, days since Grandma began, and I could see the sweat standing out on her. She was growing tired, her energy depleting, and that only seemed to encourage this hateful specter. He cackled and snapped his teeth at her, the bones coming together like rocks in a quarry, and I found myself growing cold as I watched him rebuff her attempts to cast him away.
Foolish old woman! Your incantations are no more than the banging of bones and the screeching of apes. I was old when your kind scratched upon the dirt, and you cannot face me and win, shaman.
Grandma didn't let it show, but it appeared that she had come to the same conclusion. She began to retreat, the two of us backing towards the quilted egress point, but the shadows would not allow it. They closed in around that square of light, thick and claustrophobic, and I feared to let them touch me. It appeared that dueling to a draw would not be enough for whatever resided within Daryl. It wanted to win, and it knew that it had us on the ropes. Grandma looked down at me as she came to realize this as well, and apologized as she drew me close against her. Then the door banged open like a gunshot, and I heard the hard tack of boots on the sturdy boards as someone came towards the sitting room. The darkness parted for that one, and as he surveyed the scene, he smiled in the loony, sane way that men do when they've spent too much time away from other men. The way wood folks or desert dwellers sometimes smile when tried by some child of fluorescent lights and the steady pavement, who have never known true darkness as more than a dim movie screen. He wore a long coat, his chest bare, with shabby jeans that nearly covered his run-down cowboy boots. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, less like a cowboy's and more like a farmer's or a preacher maybe, and on his belt swung a writhing sack that hissed and rattled. The hair that poked from beneath that hat was white as midday clouds, and he looked like a scarecrow filled with barbed wire. I have no doubt that he was a little crazy, but he was the sanity we needed at that moment. He came striding into the room, untying the sack from his belt, and the creature's glee seemed forced to my ears.
Ah, another shaman to try his luck. Come to me, pretender. Come to me and know what it means to stand before Legion.
The man's voice was at odds with his appearance, and his voice was rich and strident as it cut through the shadows in the house. I am no pretender, and you are no legion. You are a sad collection of lesser demons, fit only to scare children and vex those who are used to fighting less practical creatures. No offense, my dear. Grandmother seemed to take this declaration well from her stunned position near the door. When he reached inside the bag, the hollow rattle preceded the biggest timber rattler I had ever seen. The creature cowered a little as the face of the betrayer came out to greet him. "Here is your brother, Prince of Lies, Lord of Flies. Come now before the throne and feel his judgment." He held the rattler around the head, his thumb controlling the top as his fingers opened that killing mouth. The couch shook as the mountainous man mound tried to escape him, but as the strange man began to pray, really spinning the hellfire, I saw the snake begin to glow. Its head and body was suddenly wreathed in a glowing aura, and that aura began to draw darkness from Darrell. The murk seemed to come swimming from his open mouth, and as it entered the serpent, the preacher dropped it and watched it try to escape. Then, as swift as any snake, the snake handler brought the bottom of that big run-down boot on the snake's head and smashed it out of existence. The man-thing on the couch screamed in agony, its gelatinous body quaking like water in a pool, but the snake handler was far from done. He reached in again and drew out another snake, the black body of a moccasin coming free from the bag this time. It hissed and reared at him, but he had caught it just so, and its writhing stopped as the corona of light enveloped it. The feet of the couch squealed in protest as the demon tried to lunge away, but they had made their vessel too large, and escape seemed like a happy dream before those dripping fangs. His bag seemed limitless. The snake handler seemed to pull more varieties of serpent from that crocus sack than I had ever seen before. Some were venomous, some were plain old slitherers, but their fates were always the same. The floor was soon thick with clotted snake blood, and the man on the couch seemed to be shrieking with every otherworldly presence pulled from him. All at once, he was less of a mountain and more of a rotund boulder. Suddenly, he was merely portly, his flesh still stretched and bruised where the demons had taken up inside of him. He tried to flee once, his legs bucking under him, before the snake handler could catch his shoulders and push him against the couch. The snake he pulled from the bag was the biggest yet, a massive rattlesnake with glistening fangs, and the demon quaked before him, knowing his time had come. "You dare not! You dare not! You are nothing! I was old when your ancestors drew out of the primordial ooze. My ancestors stumbled naked from the garden, wretch, and you will return to the pits from whence you came," the snake-handling man screamed at him. The demon's screams cascaded around us as he was laboriously drawn from the man, and the snake actually turned to strike as he fell heavily to the floor. The boot came down nonetheless, and the snake handler seemed to sag as the man on the couch breathed like a long-distance runner passing the finish line. Somehow, it had escaped my notice that the shadows were receding as he worked, and we now stood in the dimly lit sitting room of Ellie and Darrell's house. Darrell wouldn't wake up for another 3 days, and when he did, he told my grandma about breaking through into an underground tunnel and falling into a pool of the coldest water he had ever felt. As he pulled himself out, shivering on the banks, he was assaulted by things he couldn't see, and he had known nothing until he came to on the couch. He didn't remember the snake handler, the demons, or anything of the like. Darrell lived until 1973, dying at the age of 93, and he always thanked God for his longevity. He should have really have thanked the snake-handling man, though, because otherwise the demons would have likely just ate him up. That night, though, with his work completed, the snake handler bent down and scooped up the remains of his snakes into the crocus sack. He tipped his hat to Ellie, now hugging her husband and crying over him,
and told her he was real sorry about the mess. He clomped out the door, stopping just long enough to look down at Grandma and me and pass a word with us. You gave it your best, child of the White, but there was just too many there for one person. You did your best. Know that God sees your efforts. Then he left, never to be seen again in these parts.
I had stopped rocking at some point in the story, and was now simply sitting gape-mouthed and staring at Grandpa.
Quite a tale, isn't it?
Grandpa asked, his old chair creaking a little as the two of us sat in the aftermath. So, you know a little about the backwoods ways? Like your grandmother knew? I started, trying to figure out what I wanted to say.
Some, he admitted. Grandma died before she could properly finish my training, but there's a whole different story, and I'll need to prepare before I tell it to you.
Could you teach me? I asked, fully aware by now that there were things in this world, in this very forest, that I didn't understand and did not want to run afoul of. Grandpa smiled.
Son, I'd be delighted. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story.
I hope you've enjoyed our return trip to the Appalachians. Rest assured, though, there will be many more Appalachian Grandpa stories to come, especially the tale of what happened to his grandmother. I may put these in a book someday. I don't know. I'm still playing around with the idea, but if it happens, I'm sure I'll let you guys know here. Let's go ahead and thank our sponsors before we sign off. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being members of our Spooky Skeleton tier, and thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. I've got some new goals up on Patreon if you're thinking about joining. They're a little lofty, I know, but they get you guys extra stories every week, and maybe a 5-day-a-week update schedule. I'm slowly attempting to transition away from work and maybe doing YouTube full-time, so your contributions and your support are always greatly appreciated. Speaking of support, I've got a new book coming out in a few months. You could always head on down to Amazon and get caught up. I always suggest Stragview stories, since it's probably one of my favorite collections, a collection of prison short stories that take place in the mythical prison of Stragview, a place where the shadows, as well as the warden, often seem to hold sway. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.